All right, good morning. Good to see everybody here this morning. We're going to be in Acts chapter 15, starting in verse 36 here in a moment. And we've been going verse by verse through the New Testament, just taking passage by passage, story by story as we've gone through. And we find ourselves here in Acts chapter 15. And last time we saw a conflict that arose within the church that was of a theological concern. The Gentiles are now being received into the church, and the question arose, should they be circumcised, and do they have to keep the law of Moses? And so a big portion of Acts chapter 15 is dedicated towards the church working through that disagreement and coming up with a resolution that seems to have satisfied everyone, at least the majority of the people. And we studied that in some detail a couple weeks ago. But today we're going to look at a conflict that's not of a theological concern, but of a practical concern. Not so much about, what must a person do to be saved or what's in connection to a person and how they should live before the Lord, but whether we should bring John Mark along on our next missionary journey. This is the conflict that arises between Paul and Barnabas. And we're going to see some principles, some practical application that we can draw from this as we too perhaps encounter conflict from time to time. But first, let's read the text. This is Acts chapter 15, verses 36 through 41. It says, "After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, 'Let us return and visit the brethren in every city in which we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are.' Barnabas wanted to take John, called Mark, along with them also. But Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there occurred such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another, and Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and left, being committed by the brethren to the grace of the Lord. And he was traveling through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches." All right, so we can see this great conflict that occurs, this personal conflict between Paul and Barnabas in connection to where they should take John Mark. Keep in mind, we studied in some detail the first missionary journey in which they went into Cyprus, and then they went up into Pamphylia and kind of went in the western edges of Galatia there, and then they returned back again. Well, Paul brings up to Barnabas, he says, let's go back and go back to the churches, strengthen them, kind of see how they're doing. This is right along with Paul's character. He wasn't just interested in saving souls. He definitely was interested in doing that, but he was also had a heart for the church. And he really wanted to see that this church was strengthened, which is important, right? We don't want to just baptize people and then, okay, well, you're on your own. Of course, we want to go back and check on them and make sure that they're being strengthened in the Lord, that they're growing in their faith. And Paul wanted to do that for the church. He lived in an age when you couldn't just shoot an email or get on a Zoom call to check up on the church. If you really wanted to know how they were doing, the best way to do it would be to go and personally be there. And I think even if Paul had those resources, he still would have wanted to be physically present with those churches so that he could be with them in person and strengthen them. So that's what Paul's desire is. And he gets Barnabas in on this and says, let's go back to all those churches that we ministered to and established. Well, Barnabas wants to take John Mark. And if you remember in Acts chapter 13 and verse 13, John Mark had left him. They were about to go into Pamphylia, and all it really states is that John Mark left. Doesn't tell us why, doesn't say, for what reason John Mark left, but for whatever reason, he left. And there's probably several theories as to why John Mark left, but probably one of the two prominent ones is this: either John Mark became ill, and maybe he left because, they're in the middle of this missionary journey. He becomes sick, he becomes ill, and he's no longer able to journey further. And so he has to go back and turn back so that he can take care of the fact that he's sick, that he's ill. And maybe the Apostle Paul is concerned, saying, if John Mark got sick, if he was ill during the first missionary journey, what happens if it occurs again? It may be in less convenient circumstances, and that would hinder the work of the Lord and us being able to move forward and strengthening these churches. So that's one theory. But I kind of lean towards another one. And again, they're theories. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly where or why John Mark left, but we can infer some things based on what we know. And that is, it might very well be the case that John Mark left because they were going to Pamphylia. Pamphylia, as we mentioned when we were going through chapter 13, it was not a pleasant place. Pamphylia was a rough place to travel. It was filled with robbers and thieves and murderers. And when you're traveling down the road, you didn't know when you were going to be mobbed or when you were going to be robbed or anything like that. As a matter of fact, some believe that there in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, when the Apostle Paul is talking about all the trials and the hardships he had as an apostle, and he mentions that he had suffered among the robbers and things like that, that might have occurred there in Pamphylia. It would have been very likely that that would have occurred. And so it's possible that John Mark left because they were going to Pamphylia, and John Mark's like, no, out of fear or whatever, he does not go. Which would match another event that is oftentimes attributed to Mark in the Gospel of Mark. Now, I always want to be very clear. You guys know that whenever we start going a little bit away into conjecture and speculation, I try to let you know so that we don't confuse the hard biblical facts that we have versus, things that are built on implication. But when you get into the Gospel of Mark, and historically, traditionally, the church has seen that Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, is the same John Mark. Okay? When you get into the Gospel of Mark, there's an individual that's mentioned, a young man who's mentioned there in the garden in chapter 14 that takes off running when things heat up there in the Garden of Gethsemane. When the mob is coming to take Jesus, in verse 51 of Mark 14, it says, a young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. And they seized him, but he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked. Biblical interpreters, scholars, of course you can't say, yes, this was Mark, but it seems to be Mark. Whenever the gospel writers mention someone and they don't really give their name, oftentimes they're talking about themselves. This happens time and time again in the Gospel of John. The disciple who Jesus loved, he'll talk about a particular disciple who was in connection to the high priest, and he doesn't necessarily mention himself. It might be that Mark's doing that there. If so, Mark might have a history of, when things heat up, he skedaddles. And maybe that's what happened here. Again, I want to be very clear, we don't know. It's just one theory that's out there. Seems to have some biblical basis, but not entirely. You can't say for sure. But for whatever reason, John Mark left. And Paul didn't like that, and Paul saw that as a problem for future endeavors with John Mark. So, Barnabas wants to take John, called Mark. Why Barnabas wanted to take him? We do know from Colossians chapter 4 that Barnabas and Mark were cousins. So some would say that, well, maybe it's because it's his relative and he wants, he loves his cousin and he wants to take him along. But it's also true that Barnabas was the type of person who gave people second chances. This is just a part of Barnabas' heart. He was a person who never judged a person by their past. Who was it that introduced Saul to the church? Remember when Saul was first converted and Saul begins to preach Jesus, and the church is like, well, I don't know, because Saul was pretty adamant about persecuting the church, and then all of a sudden now he's preaching the very Christ that he persecuted. And it's Barnabas that says, hey guys, this man's a new person, you need to accept him into the fellowship. That would be right in line with what Barnabas is doing here. Yeah, John Mark left us, he abandoned us when we were going into Pamphylia, he didn't go into the work with us, but give him a second chance, Paul. Let's give him another shot. That would be right in line with the heart of Barnabas. And so Barnabas, for whatever reason, wants to take John Mark. So this is the conflict. In verse 38, but Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And again, this makes me lean more towards maybe John Mark purposely, intentionally made the decision to leave, not because he was sick. The New American Standard renders it as he abandoned them or he deserted them in Pamphylia, which gives the indication that perhaps he, again, abandoned them purposefully, maybe because of the dangers that awaited them in Pamphylia. But nonetheless, in verse 39, it says, and there occurred such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another, and Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. And that word for sharp disagreement in the original language is the same word for irritation. It's a semi-medical term, which would not be surprising because Luke, the physician, is actually writing this. So it would be right along with him to use a semi-medical term to describe this type of disagreement. But it was an irritation between them, a conflict. Both of them were kind of rubbed the wrong way towards each other in this great conflict that they had. But it says that here that Barnabas takes Mark and sails away to Cyprus. And not only does he sail away from Cyprus, he sails away from the book of Acts. We won't see Barnabas anymore in the book of Acts. This is the last account that we have of him. Somewhat sadly enough, we'd like to hear probably more of what went on with the ventures of Barnabas. He's later mentioned by Paul. We'll talk about that later in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. But he sails away, going his own way with John Mark. In verse 40, though, Paul chose Silas and left. And there's a good reason why he would have chose Silas. We found out earlier in the chapter that Silas was one of the leading men there in Jerusalem. So he was a very reputable person, probably very knowledgeable in God's law and God's teaching. We also find out later on, we'll find out in chapter 16, that in all likelihood he was also a Roman citizen like Paul. Because when Paul kind of says, hey, y'all are treating us who are Roman citizens, he uses the plural there, which would include not only Paul, which is well known to be a Roman citizen, but would include also his companion Silas as well. So it might be that he chose Silas because he was a Roman citizen, and that would get them out of some predicaments that had they get into some legal challenges later on in their missionary journey. So a lot of reasons why Paul would want to choose Silas, but he does choose Silas, and then he leaves, being committed by the brethren to the grace of the Lord, and he travels through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So whereas Barnabas travels west and into the Mediterranean to Cyprus, very predominant Jewish area, Barnabas is going to minister there. Paul is going to take a land route up north and then eventually go west, traveling along up into Syria and Cilicia. And then he'll end up also traveling through Galatia and even end up in Macedonia, as we'll find in the next chapter, probably next week, we'll study that, where he'll go even further than he went in the first missionary journey. So it ends up being that he doesn't just travel in the same churches they went, but this split allowed Paul the freedom to actually travel further and go west and reach even more people with the gospel. All right, so that's the story. That's the story that we have here before us in the text. Now let's look at some principles that we can draw from this story. There's a lot that we can learn about conflict that arises not only just within the church context, but personally between two individuals. It could even apply towards conflict that occurs in a marriage, between friends, wherever you might find conflict. We find these principles very helpful that we can draw from this particular text. And the first one is probably the obvious. That is, conflict happens. And it even happens among the most spiritual people that you can come. I mean, who can you say is more spiritual than Paul and Barnabas? These are men that were filled with the Holy Spirit. These are people who they were committed to the Lord's cause. They even risked their own necks to proclaim the gospel. These are dedicated disciples of Christ, dedicated servants of the Lord, and still they had conflict. So we can learn from this that conflict happens, and we shouldn't be too shocked or discouraged when it does arise. And it doesn't necessarily mean that people are not wanting to do what God wants them to do, or that somehow they're not spiritual enough, otherwise they wouldn't be having this conflict. Conflict happens. I think sometimes we have an idealistic view of the church that, if we're all living according to the principle of love, and we're all living according to the fruits of the Spirit and things like that, that we should never have conflict ever, and we should never disagree about anything ever, the whole entirety of the life of the church. If we do that, we're going to become very discouraged, and we're going to become very disappointed over time. It's kind of like a married couple, right? You get married, and you think, this is wonderful, right? You've been dating, and you've been really putting on the romance maybe for some time, and then you get married and you think, oh, this is going to be great. You know, we're going to live together. We're never going to have a problem. We're just going to live on love for the rest of our lives. And then that first conflict arises, that first disagreement occurs, and you're like, oh no, did I make a mistake? Did I marry the wrong person? Is this? And you begin to panic a little bit because conflict arises. And it's important to know that conflict is just a part of having relationships. And when I talk about conflict, maybe I should define what I'm talking about. We're not talking about conflict in the sense that, like, warfare type of conflict where people are battling it out, being ugly towards each other, putting each other down, being condescending towards each other. All the conflict is that my view conflicts with your view. That's just as simple as it can be. Now, it can go to the extreme of being violent and being ugly and being nasty, but it doesn't have to be. A conflict is just, I have an idea of how things should go, and then this individual has an idea of how things should go, and they're in conflict with one another. Those ideas are in conflict with one another. That's what we find here with Paul and Barnabas. Paul had the idea that we should not take John Mark. Barnabas had the idea we should take John Mark, and those two ideas were in conflict with one another. So if we get violent conflict, and we're getting conflict where people are just tearing into one another, yeah, that is, a red flag should come up. We should, put on the brakes and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? But just people disagreeing should never be something that causes us to become discouraged or put out. It's going to happen. People are going to disagree on things. Again, if it happened between these two spiritual powerhouses, for lack of a better term, it can happen with any of us. So we need to understand that. Now, the next point might be a little bit harder to swallow. We all know that conflict happens and happens in all different type of relationships and all different contexts. But the next one might be a little bit more challenging, and that is that conflict can be actually good. And that's a hard thing to take in. And you read all the recent leadership books, you take a leadership training or take a leadership class, pretty much consistently, they're always going to say conflict isn't always bad. Conflict can sometimes be good, can actually be a good thing. And that might be challenging to the average person, especially within a church context, because you're like, wait a minute, aren't we supposed to be loving one another, be peaceable? Shouldn't we just be more concerned with getting along than bringing up disagreements and things like that? Well, it is true we should have that heart, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. We should have that heart all the way through the conflict, but it doesn't mean that we won't ever disagree, and it doesn't mean that disagreements can't be actually a good thing. And there's basically two reasons that we can draw from the text. There's many more reasons we might give, but trying to stay true to the text here. One reason conflict can sometimes be good is because it shows that people are actually passionate about what they're doing. Paul and Barnabas are having this conflict because they feel very strongly about the Lord's work. They really want God's work to be unhindered. Barnabas seems to be very concerned about not pushing aside a willing vessel who wants to come along with the work. I mean, they have very good, very big or important foundational reasons why they're doing it, and they're very passionate about those things, and that's where the disagreement comes up. Whenever you find a situation where there is no conflict, you oftentimes will find there's also a place where there is no passion. And you ever, after church, everyone kind of stands around and they're like, okay, where do you guys want to eat? This used to happen a lot at the church we were at when we lived in Austin, because there's a multitude of places to eat. Everyone would just stand around and be like, I don't know, wherever you want to eat. I don't care where we eat, as long as we eat somewhere. And then the next person would say, well, I don't care where we eat. There's no conflict in that situation, right? No conflict going on, but there's also no passion. If there was a person who's very passionate about Mexican food or very passionate about country cooking or something like that, and they were, disagreeing with one another, we say, okay, there's some passion. There's some passionate people about the type of food that they eat. The lack of conflict oftentimes reflects a lack of passion. You're not going to disagree with another person on something you don't care about. Had Paul and Barnabas who said, well, it's not a big deal. We're just doing this for whatever reason, there would be no real sharp disagreement between them. But these are two passionate people who care about the Lord, who care about the work of the Lord, and the disagreement arises out of that. And so conflict, yes, can be a bad indicator. It can be an indicator that people have the wrong type of heart and attitude towards one another, but it can also be a good indicator that at least people are passionate about the Lord's work, so much so that they're willing to work through disagreements in order for that to occur. But then there's another reason, as mentioned, a reason why conflict can be good, because what it does is it allows no room for unresolved issues. Think about this situation. Think about if Paul didn't bring this up. Barnabas says, I'm bringing John Mark along just like we did before. And Paul just kind of gritted his teeth and he didn't really speak up. He didn't disagree. He just kind of went along with it because he didn't, I owe Barnabas one for introducing me to the church. And so I don't want to cause any disagreement between me and Barnabas. So he just kind of went along with it. We can imagine what Paul's attitude would have been throughout that whole second missionary journey. It perhaps could have been very difficult for Paul to interact with John Mark, maybe have some resentment towards him or have some resentment towards the situation. We can see the type of temptations and challenges Paul would have had he not spoken up and had he gone along with John Mark going on the journey. And oftentimes that happens. You'll find that in relationships. It can be in a marriage, it can be in a church, it can be at work. A person has an issue and they don't speak about it because they don't want to cause conflict. But that unresolved issue festers. And it builds up and it becomes more and more intense as time goes on, to where the person becomes resentful and is really challenged to carry on a relationship with the other individual, whoever it might be. It could be multiple individuals. But conflict can sometimes bring to surface unresolved issues. And sometimes it's not even that particular thing, right? You see that in marriages? They're fighting over the dishes, but it's not really the dishes they're fighting over. It's something deeper underneath there. But whenever you don't shy away from that conflict and you really begin to dig and see what is the true issue here, you can get that unresolved issue taken care of and then move forward in your relationship. And conflict can bring that about. Good conflict, proper conflict can bring that process about. So we don't want to say all conflict is good, but we also don't want to say all conflict is bad. There's some good that can come out of wholesome conflict that can arise, some disagreements that can arise between individuals and even in churches. So conflict happens. Might as well just come to realize that at some point a disagreement is going to occur. 2, not all conflict is bad. Some conflict is good. And then we have another principle that we can draw from here. And that is, we should never abandon the mission because of the conflict. Imagine if Paul and Barnabas would have said, we can't agree on John Mark. You know what? Let's just scrap the whole idea. Let's not go on the missionary journey. Let's just, go back to Antioch. We'll continue to minister there. Maybe this was a bad idea because we can't see eye to eye here in connection to John Mark. Think of all the work that would have been missed. I mean, Macedonia, in all likelihood, would not have heard the gospel. Paul wouldn't have been able to spend 3 years in Ephesus, and the Philippian jailer would not have been converted. I mean, a lot of good work would have been missed had they just said, well, because of conflict, we can't move forward. Never allow a disagreement, or when you're challenged with another individual on how to move forward, never allow that to just scrap the whole thing. That's the easy route. That's the less painful route, but it's not always the best route. Realize that, we should still adhere to what we are here to do. Even as a church, what is our mission here? Our mission, 1, is to build each other up in love, to build each other and edify one another until we reach the stature and the measure of Jesus Christ, to be grounded in the Word and all those things. Internally, that's what we're all about. Externally, our mission is to get the gospel out to our community and to become a light to the community so that more people can come to the truth and the knowledge of Jesus Christ. That's our mission. And we should never allow just disagreements among us or disagreements among other people to hinder that, or especially not to cause that to cease. We got to work through those issues so that we can still stay true to the mission and we can move forward in accomplishing the mission that God has for us. Also, from this text we can find a resolution should be sought that both can live with and that won't impede the mission. A resolution should be sought that both can live with and that will not impede the mission. I think some would read this text and say, this was bad. This was a bad resolution. Paul and Barnabas split ways. That's horrible. They split in different directions. They couldn't see eye to eye, so they just went in different directions. That is one way to look at it, but I would suggest another way to look at it, and it's that they found a resolution to the problem. The resolution to the problem was, we can both be satisfied, we can both still continue our work, we can both still continue our ministry if we part ways. And we just determined to go in different directions. And that was the resolution that they gave that satisfied both of them, rather than trying to continue on with this conflict and this unresolved issue along the way while they're trying to do the missionary journey, or just giving up on the missionary journey altogether. They found a resolution where they could both continue to minister, where they could both do what they were called to do and not be hindered. And that should be our desire. Every conflict, we should seek a resolution as quickly as possible. The more and more we don't resolve conflict, the more and more there's disagreements among individuals. Again, I know I keep saying this, but this applies to all relationships. The more and more you allow a conflict to kind of carry on, it becomes corroded and contaminated and heavier and heavier and heavier as time goes on. It's like that snowball that just gets bigger and bigger as time goes on. Conflict can sometimes be good, but it's good conflict if it gets resolved in a timely manner. You don't want it to go on forever and ever. And so we need to come to a resolution as quickly as possible. How is it that we can come to a solution in which everyone is at least to the point where they can live with it? You may not, anytime you have some type of compromise or something like that, someone's not going to get in totality what they want. But at least can both parties live with this resolution? Can both parties be satisfied with this solution? But whatever the problem is, or whatever that resolution might be, we should desire it. We want to squash conflict as quick as possible, so that it doesn't grow into something that is dangerous and can hinder the work. Next, we find that God is not hindered by imperfect situations in the text. And that's definitely true in this story, right? We would read it and we say, this is a very bad situation. Paul and Barnabas can't get along with one another. They're in conflict over John Mark. How do you think John Mark feels during this whole episode, you know? It seems like a bad situation, but think about what came out of this situation. Barnabas, well, for one, not one team went out and did a missionary journey, but two teams now went out. So the work doubled, right? Now you have 4 people going out and doing the work instead of just 2 or possibly 3. And you have them going in different directions where more people can be reached. God's word can spread further. We see it going further west. Had they just stuck with the original plan, they just would have gone up to Cyprus and they would have gone through Pamphylia and perhaps just came right on back to Antioch. But because they split ways, again, it freed up Paul and Silas to even go further, as God's going to call them all the way to Macedonia. Macedonia was very far west of where they had, the furthest west that they went on the first missionary journey. So they got to go very, very far out. But a lot of that was facilitated by them splitting up and God's, of course, working in the situation to cause the best result to come of it. So that's important for us to understand that God can work through imperfect situations. We may think, well, only if we come up with the perfect solution, or only if we're working in the most perfect way without any mistakes or any hiccups or challenges, only then God can work in our church. But you see it all through scriptures. God working through messed up relationships, kingdoms that were corrupt political figures. I mean, God worked through all types of human imperfections and still brought about his overall sovereign plan. And so we should never think, well, that's it. Okay, we had a conflict, we had a disagreement, or something's not perfect within our church, therefore God can't do anything. God can still work mightily and still perform his will, even though it might be through imperfect creatures such as ourselves. Never forget that, and continue to pray for God's sovereign will to occur throughout the the whole time that perhaps the conflict is going on, and afterwards as well, of course. And then, lastly, we learn that though conflict occurs, we should always maintain love. And maybe this is one of the most important points that we have this morning, and it's good that this is our last point, I believe, because this is very important. It's very important for us to remember that, yes, conflict is good. It happens. It's going to happen. It sometimes is good, not always good, but oftentimes it's good. It shows that people are passionate. It leaves no unresolved issues. We don't abandon the mission because of it. We should seek resolution, yes, but God is not hindered by the imperfect situations we find ourselves in. But through all that, it ought to be that we maintain love. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I referenced this earlier, but now we'll take a look at it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, the Apostle Paul mentions Barnabas. And chapter 9 and verse 6. Now keep in mind, 1 Corinthians is believed to have been written the third year that Paul is in Ephesus. So this is after the conflict. This is while Paul's, in Ephesus. So this is after the conflict. This isn't him talking about Barnabas before all this occurs. That's important. So he says here, or do only Barnabas and I not have a right to refrain from working? Who at any time has a soldier at any expense? Now, there's a whole context there. There's a whole thing that Paul's teaching there. We won't get into all that. Just to mention that Paul is speaking of Barnabas as a fellow minister. And he's speaking to him as an equal to some degree. And so, clearly, Paul has no ill will towards Barnabas. He's including him here as one of his fellow workers. And again, it just shows that he didn't let the conflict cause a severance of their relationship. This is definitely true with John Mark. In Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10, Paul speaks of John Mark in a very favorable way. He says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you his greetings, and also Barnabas, his cousin, Mark, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. So he's saying, if John Mark comes to you, welcome him. Again, speaking to him in very favorable terms. In 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 11, this is getting more towards the end of Paul's life. He's in prison at this point, and he says there in 2 Timothy chapter 4 verse 11, only Luke is with me. Luke's the one that wrote this book of Acts. Keep that in mind. He says, only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. So Paul saw Mark as a very useful individual. So we can see reconciliation that occurred after this disagreement. Paul recognizes Barnabas as a fellow minister. He speaks very well of Mark years later. So the idea here is that, yes, they had conflict, they had a disagreement, but they still maintained their relationship. And we always have to remember that. Allow some room for disagreement, but never allow that disagreement to become so sharp that you part ways, and not just physically part ways, but part ways emotionally and relationally with one another. We always want to act in love. We all want to be in unity of spirit, being unified in our purpose and in the mission, wanting to accomplish the mission. We always want to have a cohesive group that loves one another and cares for one another, even through the challenges of going through disagreement and conflict that may occur from time to time, but always maintaining that attitude through it all. So these are some things we can learn, and we'll close the lesson with this. As we close out Acts chapter 15, we can see that conflict's going to happen. Not all conflict is bad. That it can be good. We should not abandon the mission just because some disagreement arises. A resolution should be sought as soon as possible. And that God is not hindered by imperfect situations. And though conflict occurs, we should always maintain love throughout it all. And never forsake love for the sake of getting our way or being right, quote unquote right, in the situation. So some things to reflect on here at the end of Acts chapter 15. Now, we didn't talk a whole lot about what a person should do to be saved. We didn't talk much about the gospel, but we do know that as time has gone on, we all have been in conflict with God. We've all been against God's purposes and plans in our lives, as we have violated his law. Even if you haven't read a word of the Bible, we all know in our heart of hearts that we've done things that are not right. Our conscience convicts us that we've done things that are wrong, and we know that we need to make those things right. And maybe you've been carrying a degree of guilt and recognizing that you've done some wrong things and you want to make those right before God. Come to him. He's made a way. He's given us an open door through Jesus Christ that you can come in, find mercy, find grace, find forgiveness, find a new start, and find a great relationship that you can begin with the Lord. If you would like to do that, please come forward and we'll walk you through that process. Dylan will lead us in a song. You can come